When we think of Pyongyang today, what comes to mind? Military parades? Monumental architecture? Perhaps the famous mass games? But not this. Pyongyang once looked very different. Before the war, it was a traditional Korean city, home to cobbled streets, river ferries and streetcars. A far cry from the modern capital today. These days, only a handful of these old buildings still remain. To understand Pyongyang as it exists today, we first need to understand the city that came before it. DPRK Explained is powered entirely by your support, both here on YouTube and through direct backing on Patreon. If you would like to help support the channel, check out the Patreon linked in the description for behind the scenes updates, early access to videos and much, much more. As the 20th century began, Pyongyang was a different city. This map was published in 1914 as a general overview of Pyongyang Prefecture, or Heijo, as it was known under the Japanese administration. It was published just 4 years after the annexation of Korea by Japan, and gives us one of the earliest glimpses into the city which would one day become the capital. There are a few immediate things to note with this map. Firstly, that almost the entire settlement sits on the west side of the river, with minimal development on the eastern side, and there are no permanent bridges crossing the river Taedong. Sources suggest that the Taedong River Bridge in central Pyongyang was completed in 1905, with a railway bridge soon after, but the maps from this period consistently show ferry crossings instead, likely a case of mapping lag rather than absence in 1914. In the early 1900s, however, until the first bridge was constructed, ferries were the only way to reach Pyongyang from the south. Unlike today's great squares and grandiose architecture, the old city was tightly centred around this area, home to the ancient Taedong Mun, or Taedong Gate, once a principal entry point to the city and, by 1914, still functioning as a ferry port across the Taedong. The historic core of Pyongyang sat around this Taedong Gate. A dense, organised network of winding streets, enclosed by ancient walls dating back to the days when Pyongyang was a fortified settlement. However, by 1914, the city had expanded beyond its walls. Beyond these ancient fortifications, the narrow streets of the old city gave way to a far more regular, structured, grid-based road layout. Where the old city was centred around the quiet beauty of the Taedong Gate, the new city was growing around a symbol of 20th century modernity, the railway station. The original Pyongyang station opened in 1906 as part of the Gyeonggi Railway, carrying goods and passengers along Korea's west coast and linking the city to the wider peninsula. It would be easy to assume then that this area was little more than a railway yard, populated only by warehouses and track sidings. But by 1914, this map tells a different story. Around the station, we begin to see elementary schools, hospitals, and police stations, suggesting that by the mid-1910s, this newer district was clearly becoming an integral part of Pyongyang itself. Just north of the station, however, we see this: a major Japanese military garrison. As the Japanese began to tighten their grip on Korea after 1910, most towns and cities would have a detachment of the occupying military to assert control over the region. No doubt this area was chosen to protect the railway as a key logistical and strategic centre. As the 1910s became the 1920s, however, this balance between old city and new, between river and railway, would begin to shift dramatically. By 1922, the area around the railway station shows the quick expansion of Pyongyang from a traditional riverside city into a centre of heavy industry and military control. This area, south of the railway station, was beginning to develop, following the same structured grid system as the rest of the new city. Most importantly, this large central area here is labelled the Chosun Weapons Manufacturing Plant, producing armaments for the Imperial Japanese occupation. Meanwhile, further north, the small garrison from 1914 grew much larger by 1922. Now home to the 77th Infantry Regiment, the map tells us, and taking up a lot of space north of the station area. But the railway did more than serve the military. Just meters from the barracks and drill grounds was Pyongyang Station itself, the city's main gateway to the rest of Korea. Meanwhile, across the rest of Pyongyang, this 1922 map shows a huge development on the eastern side of the Taedong. Or at least, it suggests that until you check the key and see that this huge sea of green-coloured development simply shows planned future development. By 1922, the eastern riverbank is home to a few scattered industrial buildings and not much else. But this map shows the intention to continue expanding the city far beyond its original footprint. And in that vein, this map finally shows the Taedong Bridge, replacing one of the ferry routes across the river. The completion of this bridge meant Pyongyang was no longer split so severely between east and west, with goods and people being able to traverse from side to side without the need for a centuries-old rowing boat. Finally, this map shows a new line running through the heart of Pyongyang. On the map, this is labelled as a proposed tramline route, something that would stitch the two halves of this city together, as it was planned to run from the railway station and, rather than bypassing the small streets of the old city, would run right past the dense shop fronts and busy residential districts. This streetcar line would be a sudden modern development for Pyongyang, a city which would still look like this as the discerning streetcar rider passed the old Taedong Gate Street. As the decades marched on, Pyongyang began to change from a historic city adapting to modernity to a colonial city organised around rail, industry and administration. By the start of the 1930s, Pyongyang had become more of a new city than an old city. Whilst the ancient stones of the Taedong Gate still stood guard along the banks of the river, they no longer looked out over open fields. Instead, the opposite bank was now occupied by buildings and infrastructure. What had once only existed on paper was now a part of daily life, as Pyongyang's streetcar network was up and running, and by 1930 was operating far beyond the original 1922 plan, beginning at the railway station, ploughing through the old city, and then up into another new emerging industrial district, ending at a new railway yard. Another branch crossed the Taedong River, stopping at the Songgyori railway station, a secondary rail connection built to serve this eastern expansion area and the heavy industrial districts springing up in East Pyongyang. This map also shows us the bus routes which were now crisscrossing the city, and, despite all these advances, the Taedongmun ferry still operating from the old city. Expansion was continuing in the south of the city, with the main Pyongyang station now showing dozens of railway sidings and offshoots to serve the rapidly industrialising city. By this point, Pyongyang was very much a new, modern city, with cars and bicycles roaming the streets and new buildings popping up all over the place. However, as the industrial economy grew, so did the city's importance to the occupying forces of Imperial Japan. By 1930, Pyongyang's military garrison had increased in size as the Japanese footprint in Korea grew firmer. No doubt by this point, the government in Tokyo had already planned their occupation of Chinese Manchuria and were rapidly developing cities in Korea to provide supplies for their imperialist expansion. In the north of Pyongyang, an area that had once been secluded and distant from the city was slowly becoming part of the city itself. This cluster of buildings is Yeongmyeongsa, a Buddhist temple complex nestled close to the riverbank at the foot of Moran Hill. This quaint complex of buildings can be seen more clearly on this tourist map from the same year, which illustrates the city's most important buildings, from the railway station and the Taedong Gate and its illustrious ferry, to the great new factory complexes and the huge airfield which had been constructed on the eastern side of the river, another sign of Pyongyang's growing modernization. Finally, we arrive at our final map of Japanese-occupied Korea. Unlike the other maps, this isn't designed to show a perfect plan of the expanding city, but it's perfect for showing how Pyongyang had developed from a small riverside settlement into a great industrial centre. Moving along this great tapestry, we see the far-off port city of Nampo, which would become Pyongyang's primary access to the open sea. We see the ever-present occupation by Japan, in the form of the weapons factory and the infantry garrison. The Pyongyang railway station is clearly marked, as is the tram network that emanates from the new centre of the city. We pass the Commercial Museum, one of the few surviving buildings which would go on to house the modern Workers' Party Founding Museum in years to come, dedicated to the fight against Japanese imperialism. We also see the Governor's Mansion, seat of the local imperialist occupation, and then clearly move into the Old City, a low-lying jigsaw of streets in the west and vast new industrial complexes in the east, connected by the Taedong Bridge. In the rapidly expanding north of the city, this hill, known at the time as Textile Spinning Hill and home to workshops, schools and factories, would one day be renamed Mansu Hill and host the famous statues of the DPRK's leadership. Further on, we see the ubiquitous Taedong Gate and its equally famous ferry, and then disappear into the Moran Hills, passing the Yeongmyeongsa Temple Complex, the Pyongyang Airfield, and looking out far into the distance as the many railways and roads demonstrate just how pivotal Pyongyang had become as a city. As the 1930s became the 1940s, Pyongyang had been reshaped into a colonial city, organised, industrial, but tightly controlled. However, the imperial war machine of Japan ground to a halt, and Pyongyang was liberated in 1945. This map shows a final snapshot of old Pyongyang, a city which, in less than a decade, would be completely razed to the ground and disappear off the map, in its original form anyway. This final map from 1946 shows us what Pyongyang had finally become. The vast complexes of refineries and factories dominating the eastern shoreline. The huge military-industrial region right behind the railway station. The construction of new railway stations at Taedonggang and in West Pyongyang. And naturally, the ferry between Taedong Gate and the eastern shore, which continued to be marked on maps. This final representation bridges the gap between modern Korea and the era of Japanese occupation, presenting us with a slight overlap which isn't often covered. Between 1945, when Korea was liberated and began forming a socialist republic, until 1950, when the bombing would begin, these old cobbled streets and ancient buildings would serve as the capital of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Celebrations of national independence and liberation were held in front of the Pyongyang City Hall, once the seat of local power for the Japanese occupation, and now a symbol of the new Pyongyang. Grand military parades were held outside the Pyongyang railway station, with troops of the Korean People's Army celebrating freedom from Japanese rule and asserting home rule over their city. However, the face of this city was about to change dramatically. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look back at Pyongyang's modern history. I'll be carrying on the story of Pyongyang next week, as we look at how the city recovered after the bombing and grew into the city we know today. If you can't wait a week, however, check out my Patreon, linked in the description, where the second part of this video is now live and ready to watch. If you want to head back in time even further, check out my History of Pyongyang in 20 minutes, where I trace 5,000 years of Pyongyang's history from the deep mists of its ancient roots to the modern day. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel here by subscribing, liking the video, and commenting which era of Pyongyang was your favourite, or by heading to the Patreon and becoming a direct backer of the project. All of your support is incredibly appreciated. Thanks for watching.